Hello everyone, and welcome to Making Monsters, a new series by Sliceprintroleplay. In this series, I'm going to be talking with different artists to get their advice and their tips on making better models, and so that you can get to know the artists behind these cool models. Alright, let's get to it. Oh, yeah, I'd like to remind everyone that I am not a professional, but I just remembered that I should probably have you introduce yourself and your Patreon.
Oh, yeah, I suppose we can go ahead and start there, and we just kind of ran right into it. Hey, everybody, my name is Michael Clute. I go by Clute, and I am the sole artist, owner, and one-man show of Epic Adventure Miniatures. I have been, my background actually comes from working on some indie video games as a conceptual artist. I've run, let's see, because you're inside the indie division, you rarely get to wear one hat. So
right.
I've done everything from conceptual art, character design, backgrounds, prop assets, animation, storyboards, UI, and even a little bit of directing.
Wow, that's awesome.
And I actually went to college, to Cal State Long Beach. Initially, I was going there for sculpture, and then since the director of that department was on sabbatical, and they were looking, they were gearing more towards or at least those that took his place, they were gearing more towards a more, I would say, performative, like a performance art method of figurative art.
Okay.
Which, by all means, I would never degrade. I think it's really fascinating. It just wasn't the type of art that I was there to make. So I decided to go back to my tried and true, which was illustration, something I've been doing since I could hold a crayon.
Right.
And got really invested in the animation department there, led by Aubrey Mintz. And that led me to a portfolio review over at DreamWorks and a couple of other things. They had a student art show, like an annual student art show, where I was one of two students selected for my college to go display there.
That's awesome.
So it was pretty cool. Ultimately, I steered away from animation, given that it required that I would would have to move to the Los Angeles area. And
yeah.
My wife and I weren't necessarily keen on the traffic, so we stayed where we were, and now I am working as a content developer for a aerospace engineering firm.
That is just hearing that is. I know some people actually who have worked for NASA specifically and worked for different firms, and it's really cool, and the different aspects to that are just awesome.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. I mean, obviously there's they definitely rely more on a specialist field. So I was kind of fortunate to land a position over here at the company that I work at, and because it's a smaller company, something that I'm very familiar with in my indie game experience, you get to wear lots of hats. So, yeah. That grants an opportunity to really zero in on a lot of different disciplines.
Yeah.
And the one thing that transcends all of that is, I think, problem solving, which people tend to forget that art itself is really that it's code for problem solving, because whatever discipline or medium that you work within, you're given essentially a task to create something, and you are navigating either material, concept, focus, and audience, and trying to drive all of that into one vision.
Right.
And so I found that, given over the years, the many hats that I've worn, that they all kind of correlate among that one concept, that core concept, which is problem solving.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I never thought about art in So, okay, for a long time, many members of my family have pretty outstanding artistic talent, and I know that they say certain talents and certain skills skip some generations. So for a long time, until pretty recently, I had assumed that art was something that you either could do or you couldn't. That there was no, gaining this magical power if you didn't already have it. And it's only recently that I've come to realize that some people may be more skilled with it than others, but it's not necessarily something that you can't refine if it's something you have an interest in. You can always learn to be better about something even if you don't necessarily have an instant knack for it. That concept art is awesome.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah, definitely. The thing I like to whenever somebody kind of will jump in and say, "Oh, you're so talented," that's amazing. People are born with talent. I've always steered more towards the fact that you may have maybe an inclination or maybe an interest in certain observation skills that lend an advantage over that, but art is definitely something that you can learn. And art itself it's a practice in OCD, because it really boils down to how much time you're willing to invest into something. And I find that when I'm creating art, time, the need to eat, use the restroom, all of that kind of seems to slip away.
Yeah.
And before you know it, you're about 6 hours in and you're like, oh wow, where did the day go?
Yeah.
So
I can definitely understand that. And I think, again, it's something that I'm coming to realize. There are different, like you said, you can have a knack for something, you can have a good predisposition for something, or have a general skill in one specific aspect. Like, I know some people who are extremely good at figuring out what colors will pair well without any kind of real explanation of how they come up with that. It's just something that their brain works in a way where they can come up with a great idea of, this color would highlight that color really well. And if you put these here, and that's a good basis for someone like a graphic designer or something like that. And then there's other people who can do a really good job with, with shadows and shading and certain things. So there are people who have predispositions and people who have, a slight advantage in certain aspects. But again, those are people who you look at their work now versus when they first started, and a little bit of training goes a long way. And even if you're someone who doesn't necessarily think that you have a lot of talent, or you think that you have a lot of aptitude for this specific, area that you're looking at, it doesn't hurt to refine it a little bit and see what kind of materials you can come up with to help give you a little bit of an edge, and then start learning how to do something better. Because I'm of the opinion that there may be some person somewhere in the world who's the absolute best at something, but everyone can learn something from someone. Like, it's just, you're never going to be so good at something that you can't find any use anywhere in the world from any documentation or any expert or anything like that.
100%. So right now I am posing, and I guess I should back up here. What I did was I actually, I like to work in folders. That's something I don't see a lot of artists doing inside Zbrush. And one of the advantages that I found to working with folders over here is that you can go ahead and do a Boolean, which will essentially merge all the subtools together.
Right.
But what it does is it merges them while getting rid of any interior geometry.
Oh,
so that, for the sake of 3D printing, is a sound practice.
Yeah.
Sometimes people will go ahead and Dynamesh to make it watertight. But if you can at all Boolean mesh it, then you will generally keep the integrity of the sculpt, all the details. Whereas Dynamesh will go ahead, it will actually, it will retopologize everything and sometimes destroy the integrity of the details, some of the creases, the valleys and peaks that you've created.
Yeah,
so,
I've actually had a little bit of experience with that. I don't, again, like I said, I'm learning this stuff as I go and getting into it because it's something I'm deeply invested in. And just in awe of when I see these models. But I have had experiences where I'll grab a model from Thingiverse or something and bring it into my slicer, and it identifies an issue with it. And a lot of times it could be something small. It could be reverse normals, or it could be gaps in the model, or whatever it might be. And then you can bring it into something like the NetFab tool, and I'm assuming that it does something similar to what you're talking about, where it will do its best to try to fill in these gaps and repair this model. But sometimes, especially in like a program like Mesh Mixer, it does its best, but it can be pretty rough on a lot of those details where those issues occur. It just kind of fills them in the best it can, or it'll just completely rip them out. And it can be a bit of an issue. So I guess it's that whole stitch in time saves 9 thing, where, just taking your time to make sure that you're buttoning up those holes and making sure that things are connected and the meshes are merged correctly can save some issues later on.
100%. So what I did was I realized that these orbs that are on the sleeve there weren't within the same folder.
Okay.
So I just moved it down and merged it to his coat. Now, presently, I'm keeping them separated from the actual figure, and the reason that I'm doing that is it was solely for making sure that I still have access to or the ability to mess around with the code itself. It's
okay.
Based on the concept art. Let's see here. Based on the concept art, you can see that there is there's a bit of folds. There is a little bit of dynamism in terms of the flow of some of just the clothing here. So before I go ahead and lock everything together, I like to kind of make sure that they're separate, so I can keep the geometry from fusing with his legs.
Okay.
And the pose of the legs are, I think the figure itself is pretty much locked in terms of the legs, because you can see down here, and this again goes back to our discussion about problem solving, because based on the pose itself, that will drastically determine how I plan my merges, my booleans, how I actually take a model from a T-pose, which was that neutral pose we saw in the very beginning.
Right.
And integrate that into the eventual pose that I'll come up with.
Right.
So on here, it's actually pretty close. It's relatively close to that neutral pose that we have already, which makes this next part drastically easier. So, but given that there's still you've got this leg that's raised, it's almost like he went from a standing position to now he's starting to walk.
Right.
This arm is a little closer to the torso and to the thigh. The staff itself is oriented in a downward position, diagonal down. But everything else is very similar to the pose in which it's the neutral pose that I started at.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Whenever if you have a pose that's close to, and I've heard that term before, the T pose, and it makes sense. It would stand to reason that the closer that you are to that neutral T pose is the less work you have to do. Obviously, the easier it's going to be. But at the same time, I've talked to a couple of different artists now, and I'm realizing the importance of figuring out the correct physicality or the correct dynamic movement for something. Because if you model a character and you pose it in a way that it's displaying some kind of an action, but you don't have consideration for the forces of that action that are involved, or the correct muscle groups that are involved with generating whatever that action might be, whether it's just walking or something, you can make a model that it looks good, but the longer you look at it, there's something weird about it, and it kind of clicks that the model, the way that it's moving, the action that it's showing doesn't quite fit right as far as looking realistic. And that's something that I'm starting to come to terms, or starting to come to realization and seeing in some of these models where, showing a dynamic action can be really, really difficult because it can take a while to get the model to look correct and look like it's moving and generating the action in a way that is real and doesn't look, sort of uncanny valley.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I think an understanding of anatomy is definitely something that helps in that arena, and it's something that I think a lot of people tend to neglect, and rightfully so. It's not easy to go ahead and get a full understanding of it. I mean, I wouldn't say that I have a complete grasp over it myself. I learn every single day. I was fortunate enough at my university that we had access to a Cadaver Lab.
Oh, wow.
And we had it was anatomy for artists class inside the illustration program, led by a professor that was just amazing. He's an amazing artist unto himself. And he's actually, I think he's the director over at Laguna Center for Art and Design right now.
Okay.
Inside their oil painting class. His name is Peter Zukovsky. And he and I became really close, but he really kind of emphasized just how important it is for, especially a figurative artist, to really kind of focus and invest in maybe understanding anatomy. And I tend to use a lot of books for reference on anatomy still to this day. And the ones that the kind of the tried and true ones that I always turn to is George Bridgman's complete guide to drawing from life. It's a really, really cheap book to go and pick up. And you can find it everywhere. It's been the same, I would say, handbook that all of the classic illustrators learn from. You can see Norman Rockwell, J.C. Leyendecker, Brahm, Gerald Brahm, another gentleman, oh gosh, what is his name? Does Steve Lichtman, that comic book?
Okay.
Dan Raposa, that's his name. He has gone on record many a time saying that that's actually how he learned how to draw.
Wow.
That he had zero talent in drawing before, and he spent a full year just drawing from that book. And the cool part about it is that even though we're talking about 3D and you're looking at a 2-dimensional image, a lot of times, from reference, we're as artists and as sculptors, we're going to be doing that anyways. But the cool thing about this book is that he draws things in very simple forms. So everything is kind of basic geometry, or at least broken down into planes that kind of emphasize the structure itself and understanding the structure.
Right. That's awesome. I'll definitely have to look into that. I have a couple of anatomy books. I had been taking a few courses a while back, so I do have some books, but I will absolutely look into that.
And then another one that I enjoy is An Anatomy for the Artist by Sarah Simbley.
Okay.
There's just some beautiful illustrations in that one, and some wonderful images that she uses of live models and anatomy, specifically where she has an overlay inside the book itself that where there's an image of a model, a nude model, and then an illustration that on some semi-transparent paper that goes right over the image of the model.
That's awesome.
Right now, I'm just kind of cleaning up some of the stretched geometry from when I posed the hand.
Okay.
And trying to add some folds, just something that makes sense for the transition here.
Yeah, this is like a lot of what you're doing is obviously to a much lesser degree, but I've done some of this when I've done some like digital kit bashing and mesh mixer and programs like that. And there have been times where something doesn't quite look right, and I'm like, you know what? Why don't I just try and see if I can? Because mesh mixer has some basic, at least as far as I understand, some basic modeling tools that aren't too bad. But every time I get into it, I end up, I'll select the brush size and the brush strength, and I have no idea what I'm doing. And I'll go in there, and everything just gets warped all crazy. I'm like, it looked better before, so I'll just Control Z and take everything away. Almost universally, occasionally I can make something look better, but not having a good understanding of what these brushes do and how to use them has definitely not been the best way of getting into it. I think if I spent some time really learning it and understanding what they did, I think that it could be a good resource, especially when you're doing that kit bashing, just to blend seams a little bit better. And I would definitely recommend that if you have the time, but unfortunately, time is something that's not always on my side.
Oh, same here. I mean, I would say, so when I first started this whole journey for me started in October of 2019.
Okay.
I had seen just how relatively accessible, in terms of at least financially, that the 3D printers, specifically a resin 3D printer, had gotten. And after years of of trying to kit bash models and miniatures, where I mean they're so small as it is, and even trying to sculpt some with green, with some green stuff, plumber's putty, or Sculpey, and not really having any degree of success with that. I was like, I'm going to take the plunge and I'm going to try my hand at digital sculpting. It's something that I've always had an interest in. I'm going to bite the bullet and give it a try. So I went and got myself a subscription to Zbrush, and started diving in, trying to find whatever tutorials I could find. And once you start going down that rabbit hole, you quickly realize that there are a lot of tutorials out there where the instructor is, they're doing a fine job for somebody who maybe has a little bit of experience in it, right?
Right.
You might be looking at a tutorial that says for beginners, and then they kind of jump in and they start moving stuff around, and before you know it, they are about 50 steps ahead of you, and you're like, wait, how did you do that? And you're just completely lost.
Yeah.
So I found myself encountering that quite a bit when I first started out, and it was really frustrating. So one of my buddies said, hey, you should probably check out this one person, Mia K, and she seems to have a pretty good following, and you might want to check it out. So I looked at one of her videos, and she does just a phenomenal job at being able to break down the interface, and in simple terms for somebody who just has zero experience with the program.
Yeah.
And just being able to kind of get you up and moving forms around, so that by the end of that tutorial, you actually have something that slightly resembles a model that you can print and kind of be proud of.
That's awesome.
So I did that and just fell in love with it. And the rest, as they say, is history. I've
definitely had that same situation, and I will at some point. I'll definitely have to check out some of her videos, and I'll have to reach out to her and see if she'd be interested in coming on to this series, I guess. But I've definitely heard her name mentioned quite a few times by quite a few different artists, and it definitely seems like she has a very important skill when it comes to teaching, and that is being able to explain difficult concepts in a attainable way for people who don't have a basis in what she's describing. So, and I see this all the time with printer, different types of tutorials, and that's one of the reasons why I've tried to make my channel a little bit more accessible to people that are, like, when I say it's a beginner's tutorial, I mean it's a beginner's tutorial. Like, I'll explain how to download files from Thingiverse, how to pull them into like how to unwrap or unzip the folder, how to pull them into your slicer, how to slice them, how to put them onto the SD card or the USB drive, whatever it might be, how to print, and then, you know, every step of the way. Because when I learn something, I want to make sure that I can follow something step by step. And when you say, you know, you grab the files and then once you slice them, you put them in your, well, hold on, like how do I slice them? And then what do I do after I slice them? And what do I do if my printer's doing this thing? And it's really easy to get lost. And I think that I'm certainly not blaming or not knocking any of the other printer tutorials or any of the other guys out there. Like they do a really great job. But I think that a lot of them have been doing this for a long time, and it might not be as apparent to them what it was like to be completely starting out. And maybe they did have a slightly different aptitude, like we were talking about before. Maybe they had a background in different machine disciplines, or like a machinist or something along those lines, where they understood how to manipulate these machines in a different way, and that did come naturally to them. But it can be really difficult sometimes for people to put themselves in the shoes of someone who is totally new to something, and to think about what's the most basic thing that you can do, and explaining it step by step. And it's definitely an important skill, and it's something that when you find someone who's able to go through that step by step and really give you a good foundation for something and explain it in a way that you can pick it up, that's an extremely useful skill and an extremely useful resource.
Absolutely. And this is one of those things that I just did that you want to kind of reserve until the very end, and that is breaking symmetry. Mm-hmm. This particular piece right here is on its own subtool layer. You can kind of see underneath here. Eventually what I'll do is I'll actually fill all this in, because that's a lot of detail, a lot of nooks and crannies for 3D printing that is just going to be A, lost, and B, kind of problematic to add supports. But rather than just based on the concept art that I'm working from, I can kind of see that there's a little bit, there's some room for some dynamic flow right here. And so in order to do that, you need to kind of break it up.
And it does, like it engages your eye, and it totally, like I said, it looks natural, and it makes sense. Like you can see action within a still image or a still model, and that's a really cool thing. And I love seeing that. And just, within 30 seconds, manipulating one part of this model made it much more engaging. And I think it's really cool that, just such a simple tweak can make such a big difference.
Definitely. I lost my color there. So this is something that it took me a little while to kind of get, and that is this having different subtools with different materials.
Interesting.
So the trick to it is I hit spacebar here, and you're going to hit mRGB. It's for like multiple RGB channels.
Okay.
And then you're going to fill object. And so what that does is, and depending on if you've got a color up here that you want, but if you hit spacebar, you can go through here and you can select a different material, make it chrome bright. You hit fill object, and then it changes the material on that, but doesn't change it anywhere else that's already been filled and where a material has been applied.
Right.
And granted, this is kind of one of those things that, in terms of 3D sculpting or doing 3D printing, all this stuff right here you're never going to see. So it ends up being one of those things where you have to think about economy of time, and sometimes like I'll go ahead and just not even worry about adding color or changing materials. But it depends. Like if I'm doing a design, if I'm doing the actual design, because of my background as an illustrator, I find that the doing colors or adding color actually helps me with the design itself. Determine the forms determine the feeling of the character. That if I decide not to do that, if I opt not to go ahead and add in the colors, I find that it's much more difficult to go ahead and find the overall feeling of that character, and the design doesn't come out quite as successful.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that as it's almost like a more involved template where you can kind of get a better understanding for how things are going to look, because you have the difference in material, you have the difference in color, and I can definitely see how that would be beneficial. And I can also see how some people might not go through that the extra step of doing that, because that's just not part of their process. But personally, I can definitely see the benefits of doing that and how it might help you conceptualize the design better and understand, how you might change certain angles or change certain aspects of the model to fit a little bit better based on some of these some of the colors and things.
Definitely. And I know a lot of my patrons will actually prefer to see the end model, like when I go and do either a three-dimensional turnaround, or maybe just a marketing image. They tend to request just a black and white or grayscale image of it, so that you can really focus on the geometry and the sculpt, the details of the sculpt.
Right.
So right here, even though the concept art that I'm looking at doesn't have a whole lot of detail here. Let's see here, make sure that I'm back on okay, right. From a personal standpoint, I know that there should be some creases, there should be some folds here that will help sell the geometry of that.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Dam standard and clay buildup, as well as hard polish, are kind of my go-to when I'm sculpting or if I'm modeling.
Okay.
I find that those tend to kind of give me the most bang for my buck, where I can kind of really keep going with modeling or sculpting, the whole sculpting process. Like right here, you can kind of see that there is there was kind of a fold right there, or a crease that was affecting the overall geometry of things. Mm-hmm. And this might be because of my the influence of that artist and that book specifically that I was talking about before, George Bridgman's Complete Guide to Drawing from Life, where there's planes and geometry that you're kind of focusing on. I find that this tends to show up if you create planes. It shows up on a 3D print much more effectively. Okay. So I use that hard polish brush quite a bit to go and help emphasize those forms.
Okay, that definitely makes sense.
So right here, I'll come back to hard polish just so I can re-emphasize some of those. Those regions right there. And you may not even, and ultimately you may not even see these, on the model itself when you print it. But
right.
Sometimes you've got to do things for personal growth and for yourself, for just so you can kind of keep with the model.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see that. There, again, in certain aspects, there have been things that I've made the decision to cut corners on something to get the project done a little faster. And then there are times where I can say, no, I'll stave off the end of this for a little bit longer because I want to really get into taking care of this thing. And maybe it won't matter. Maybe it's a 1% difference in whatever the finished product's going to be, whether it's more efficient or whatever it might be. But there are times where I personally, like, it matters to me, and there have definitely been times where going into that has become an issue, and I end up learning more about whatever process I'm working on because of it. And where I would have just moved past it, I could have just gotten the project done faster and not learned that. And in that moment, it might be a little frustrating because you feel like you're taking a lot of extra time. But I personally think that getting into something and spending a little extra time on it, especially when it matters to you, is really, really important, even if the end result doesn't end up really reflecting on the amount of time you spent on that. Because like you said, for personal growth and for your own skill, it can be a really useful experience.
Absolutely.
So there were a couple of just basic questions that like I said, I never want these to feel super stale and feel like, a typical interview. I like just having a casual chat with somebody. But there were a couple of questions that I was trying to pepper in just to see if I could give people some direction and some help whenever they were starting out, which is kind of the whole point of this.
Yeah.
So you've answered a couple of questions I would have asked. You said about anatomy, and I really appreciate that. And I'll definitely link everything that we talk about. I will link down below for anyone, watching and listening. So if you want to find any of the resources that we've discussed, you can find them in the description below. But one thing I did want to ask you was, so you're using Zbrush, which is a pretty popular tool with a lot of artists. Is that what you would recommend people, give a shot and try that just to get started? Because I know that they do have a monthly subscription. I don't know off the top of my head how much it is, but I know that
it's like $30.
Okay.
That would so because I have a background in traditional sculpting. I found that Zbrush tended to be more in line with some of the concepts and some of the oops, I had that still attached. Okay, that it's more in line with a lot of just standard sculpting practices than say something like Blender. And mind you, I think we've discussed this in the past or in certain forums, but for anybody that's watching this, don't be afraid if ZBrush is out of your budget and you're like, oh man, $30 a month I really don't have right now.
Right.
Don't let that deter you from things like Sculptress, or which is a free version of although much more limited version of ZBrush, or Blender. I mean, Blender is such a powerful program. The sculpting capabilities of that program have grown exponentially since its first inception.
Right.
But you can do rendering. You can go ahead and do you can animate, and you can sculpt. You can model. You can go ahead and do hard surfaces or hard surface geometry in that relatively simply. So there's a lot of artists I know, professional artists, that are using that for. Maybe even if ZBrush is their tried and true for doing sculpting, like say Danny Mac. If you take a look at any of his videos, he does a lot of stuff in ZBrush, but then he'll export it into Blender to do maybe hair, to do to go ahead and actually to do any sort of posing, to go ahead and render the model for marketing purposes. To do turnarounds, all of that stuff he'll go ahead and do in Blender because it's just that powerful. So I would say to anybody who is starting out and just kind of like, you know what, I'm not sure if I have the funds to go and invest in it. You don't have to go and do it. And part of this whole thing is about learning what your process is, because as you start to develop yourself as an artist, you're gonna go to a set of tools, and the tools don't make the artist. That all comes from exploration, from just taking the time and throwing effort into it.
Right.
Everything else will go ahead and will actually will come back to you.
Yeah. Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and that's fits with obviously I had talked to Manuel about 2 weeks ago, I think, and we had gone over more or less the same thing, and I definitely appreciate that you guys are of like minds in this, where he had said more or less the same, that Blender is a great tool to get started, and some people continuously use it. Some people don't end up moving into any other programs, and I think that's great, because Blender has a very they have a very appealing price point and a very appealing price model that I personally think is really nice. And while ZBrush is I don't want to say a better or more popular option, it is something that more artists tend to use. So some people might think that that's sort of their only option out there, and there are other options. Though there's one thing I wanted to mention. I looked into it after we talked about it in the last episode. Sculptures is actually no longer being supported. It is still available, but it is no longer being supported and no longer being updated. So it may have some issues with certain systems, depending on what OS you're running and depending on what peripherals you're trying to use with it. I don't know specifics. I haven't really gotten into it. I do know that the newer version of what it's kind of merged into is now called ZBrush Mini Core, I believe.
Correct.
And it lets you do some pretty cool things. However, the export options seem to be very limited. So if it's something you kind of want to get a feel for something and you want to work at the actual sculpting side of things, that sounds like a great resource. However, when it comes to actually exporting it, if you want to see, the printed model or work with it, it seems like it is a bit limited there.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a good program to go and get your feet wet, which is what I think their model is based on.
Right.
But if you just want to kind of, if your budget is free, then definitely give it a shot. And again, don't be afraid to go and use Blender. There are plenty of tutorials out there. There are plenty of artists that are using Blender as their go-to.
Yeah.
And so there's nothing wrong with using a free resource.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that, again, it's important to know what your limitations are as far as your budget, and to know that shouldn't stand in your way. There have been a lot of times where I've known a lot of people, and I've personally done this myself, where you can put something up on a pedestal specifically dependent on price, because, once I have enough money saved up, I can get into this thing and start working on this. But if part of your process is saving up money to get something that's going to take longer to get into a certain hobby, then it might not be the best option, depending on what you're doing. I personally think that getting started with what you can afford at the time is a good way to go. So if you can find an art tablet that fits your price range, and maybe it doesn't have, all the best reviews, and it's not what's recommended by the majority of the people out there, but it's what you can afford, then get it. If it's really that awful, if you don't like it, or it's not working correctly, you can always, return it or work with what you have. But the main point is that I think that being limited by your budget is a hindrance in a lot of different hobbies, especially when it comes to any kind of artwork, because art is and can very quickly become a very expensive hobby. If you want to go with what the top recommendations are for the the best equipment and the best whatever, you're gonna find yourself in a pretty deep hole pretty quick. So definitely stick with whatever your budget can afford. If it's free programs and all you have is a mouse and keyboard right now, you can at least get started. It's not going to be the best experience, but it's enough to get started. And if you find that it's something you enjoy and you're getting results, and it's something that you feel you want to invest more time and energy into, then definitely look for some peripherals that are within your budget. But I think that's really good advice, that Blender can be a really great tool to use to not only get into the hobby, but also to potentially refine your skills later on if it's something you want to continue with. But that's more or less were most of the questions that I had. The only other one that I was going to ask about was equipment, and I think we more or less covered that. But just out of curiosity, what's kind of like your go-to piece or pieces of equipment?
So I use a Wacom Cintiq a Cintiq Pro 22-inch right now.
Okay.
I started off with a Wacom. It was a used one that I found on eBay, which I would highly recommend anybody that is that's kind of, you know, within a certain budget. You're like, oh, you know what? I'm looking at the Huons, and you know, I can get a 13-inch one for $200, or I can go online find a used Wacom Cintiq older model that's like 18 inches, and it's not HD. It's but it's responsive. The pressure sensitivity levels are there, and you're just kind of not. If you're one of those people that is a little reluctant to use, say, a non-brand or off-brand, you're like, yeah, don't be afraid to go ahead and invest in maybe a used piece of equipment there. I used my my first Wacom Cintiq for, oh gosh, I got it used, and I think I had it for about 5 or 6 years.
Wow.
And it was a Wacom 18-inch Cintiq. And I tried I think it was called a Unova. That was, I think, also 18 inches at the time. And the stylus was battery operated or battery dependent, and a bunch of other things. And I just didn't necessarily care for it.
Right.
So I went back to my Cintiq, and when that one finally died, and I tried to go and get it repaired, and was running into issues with that, I found a newer version. It was a Wacom Cintiq HD Touch for, oh gosh, well below what it was going for brand new. And then I had that for a good, I want to say another 4 years.
Okay.
And then I made the move to a Mac not so long ago. I was PC, built my own PCs, and when you're into video games, that's kind of the way you go. You don't.
Right.
Macs aren't necessarily known for being friendly in the video game industry, or at least you don't even encounter a lot of video games that you can play on it. But I wanted kind of a cleaner workspace, so I went with a Mac, with an iMac, just so I could just have everything all in one. And I was still doing 2D illustrations at the time, so
Right.
it met the requirements quite easily.
Yeah.
But the moment I got into this hobby, that's when everything changed, and it was no longer effective for what it is that I did. So I went ahead and got rid of my iMac, and I went back to PC, built my PC, and at the same time, my Cintiq died. So, so I had to go and buy a new one, and
Right.
so now I'm working with a Cintiq Pro.
Nice. Okay. Yeah, and I mean, again, there are definitely different requirements when it comes to the system that you're using, and there are ways that you can minimize the impact certain programs have on systems. And maybe at some point I'll do a series or a couple of videos explaining how you can both software side and hardware side maximize efficiencies that your computer can run some of these programs a little bit better. As far as I know, most of these programs aren't too tough, but there's a minimum that you need. I think probably 4 gigs is minimum. It's going to be a little rough. You want to go for something more like 6 or 8, and you want a decent processor, something that's going to be like at least like probably a Ryzen 3 at minimum. There's certain things that you should be shooting for. But again, if you have a laptop and it runs it's a little slow, but you can deal with it, then go with that. If you have the funds and you have the desire to build a computer, then, absolutely go for it. If it's something that fits within your budget to do so, and it's something you're really interested in. And, I recently rebuilt my computer because I wanted to do some upgrades to it, and I'm really happy with it, but I had been running the previous build for 5 years, and it was a little frustrating at times depending on what I was doing with it. But for the most part, it served me pretty well. And I'm happy that I spent the money elsewhere whenever I had something I wanted to work on or something I wanted to upgrade. But again, do what fits within your budget, and certainly do some research. If you're going to upgrade on something, make sure you understand the requirements and make sure that you're getting the best bang for your buck when it comes to tablets or upgrades or things like that. And like I said, it's definitely a great idea, and I totally agree. Buying used tech is usually, if you do some research first, can be a great experience. There are certain things, especially when it comes to building PCs, that you should definitely steer clear of. But for the most part, you can get some really great deals. Just as a quick example, never buy a used power supply. Never do it. It's not worth it.
Definitely.
You'll probably have pretty good luck buying video cards, and processors. It's usually a pretty safe bet as well. But yeah, power supplies are one that I highly recommend. You get new. It's just not worth it.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I think that's really good advice. Is go with what your budget will allow, and upgrade as your skills and your passion for this hobby grow. And because you might find out it's not something that you particularly enjoy, or it's something that you have as much of an interest in as you thought you did, and that's fine. Getting into something and understanding it and seeing it for what it is rather than what you think it might be is really important. It's why I think what's the word I'm looking for? Not internship. There's an older term for it.
Mentorship?
Yeah, something like. There's another word for it that I'm trying to think of. I can't. It's like an old word. I'm trying. This is terrible. It'll come to me. But back in the day, if you wanted to be a smith, then you worked. You worked
as an apprentice.
Apprentice, that's the one I'm looking for. Okay. Yeah, like I think that can be, the newer version of that is an internship, and I think that's why apprenticeships are kind of an undervalued thing these days, at least in my opinion. Learning the physical, real world aspect of something that you're interested in before spending a whole lot of time and energy and money on it is a really important avenue to take. It's a really important bit of information that you can gather, not just reading about something, but getting into it and understanding it for yourself before spending a lot of money is a really good idea that I think can save a lot of people. Because like I said, I've definitely gotten into issues before where I think, I would love to learn how to, I don't know, pick something, anything. I've had so many different hobbies, coding or something like that. I'd love to learn how to do that. And then I get into it and realize how incredibly tedious it is, and I just don't have the mind for it, and it wasn't what I thought it was. And that's fine. Learning and growing and testing things out and finding what you're passionate for is a really, really good a good practice. Not to just jump in something and then not beat your fist against a wall for a while trying to do something that you don't really have that much of an interest in because you've spent a whole bunch of money on it and whatever else you've gone through to get where you are with it. But yeah, like I said, that's all kind of wrapped up in the same thing for me, and I definitely agree and appreciate that sentiment that do what your budget allows, and do get some understanding of it and learn some of these programs and some of these tools and things before spending a whole lot of money on it, just to make sure it's something that really is going to be an interest to you.
Oh, definitely. I mean, and it's one of those things that you have to. Perhaps it also depends on what your plans are for it as well.
Right.
I think if your goal is to just have a really cool hobby, then it depends on. It still boils down to whatever your budget is.
Right.
But if your plans are viewed as professionally, then the investment might actually be worth it and might even be warranted and required.
Right. Oh, yeah.
If this is something, that again, you're still just trying to get your feet wet in and just kind of trying to figure it out still, then yeah, you spending, $300 or $3,000 on a tablet, it's probably not the wisest of investments. Or maybe, I don't know, I'm not sure it depends on, again, what your budget is.
Right.
Maybe you're able to go ahead and spend lots of money on stuff, and you're just fortunate that way.
Yeah. But yeah,
but it should. I'm under the mindset that it should never detour you if this is a passion and you have a desire, you have a need to create. There's always going to be a way for you to accomplish that. Again, going back to how at the core art is really about problem solving.
Yeah.
So there's definitely there's a lot of people in this community, which again, I mean, that's another part of this entire journey that I've made, that I've just been overwhelmed with in terms of positivity, is the number of people that are just willing to go ahead and give information, give advice, give access or give tips on resources and where to go. Man, this community is so cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I that's a big part of the reason why this series has become what it is. Originally, it was something very different, and I was every time I've worked with an artist or gotten to know someone, it has changed. The iterations have moved into something different, or it's evolved in some way, and it's been a really, really cool experience to be able to talk to these different artists, because at first I was really nervous that you go to somebody and say, hey, can you show someone how to do what you do for a living for free? Are you willing to teach someone something you spent years of your time learning how to do? But the thing is that, first of all, you or any other artist out there, you're not going to be able to teach all of your knowledge in one 60-90 minute segment. Like it's not going to happen. It's impossible. And two, the difference between being driven to succeed with something and being interested as a hobby it's a pretty large disparity there. But I was really nervous for a while to talk to artists about this kind of series, because I was worried that they would turn me down and be offended that I was asking them to do something so detrimental to their business for free. But it's been completely the opposite, and I've had so many great encounters with so many cool artists that have just been really helpful, and they've helped me. Like I said, they've helped me refine this series and made it something totally different that I'm really, really excited about. And talking with people like you and Manuel and Max from the Printing Goes Ever On, and like different Patreons that I've worked with and talked to, and like it's been a really great experience that I could not have found more enjoyable, because this community is really interested in helping and seeing others grow.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's as an artist, you get that's the only way to find inspiration, is when you see somebody doing something super cool. I don't know, maybe it could be different for other people. I shouldn't speak in absolutes there, but I know myself as an artist, I get really, really inspired when I see somebody do something, and it may not just be like, oh man, that's it's not about copying or anything like that. It's that sometimes it's just a matter of seeing somebody who came up with a different idea and go, oh wow, I never thought about making a orc look like that, or or just looking or analyzing different forms. The process. I mean, I don't know about you, but I get completely hooked and mesmerized by like speed sculpt videos.
Yeah.
And before I know it, I'm like, oh gosh, where did the time go? I'm supposed to be sculpting right now. And here
right.
I did. I watched somebody else sculpt for like 2 hours.
Yeah.
But it's that just alone, like being able to go and see other people and just their approach to things, their idea of how something is how forms are supposed to look. I mean, it's why I got into it. Because let's face it, there are some amazing sculpts out there already.
Yeah.
So, if I really was just kind of looking to go ahead and have something on the board of the games that I run, there's always going to be something that I could go ahead and find, and heck, you can find it for free. There are plenty of people on Thingiverse and other platforms that they have an entire library of monsters, characters for free.
Yeah.
But I always want, like being an illustrator, I always sought to try and make the characters that I drew have a representation on the boards. And I mean, I've been playing since the early 90s. So I have about 3 decades worth of gaming within my library there,
right.
And miniatures have always been a huge component of our sessions.
Yeah.
So being able to go ahead and take a model from the hobby shop that we've got, and then retrofit it, kit bash it so that it looks a little closer to our characters, is something that we did for a long time, but it never quite. It was never perfect. It never really matched the illustrations that I did.
Right.
So when the opportunity came to make my own, I jumped at it. Especially given that I don't know about you, but trying to go ahead and sculpt at a physical model at that scale. It's just my hands are just too darn shaky for that.
Yeah. I've dabbled in it a few times, and every time I remember why I'm no good at it. I have massive hands, and it's just difficult for me to get in there and see those fine details, and inevitably, because it's not something that I've done a ton, and it's a character flaw that I've been working on for many years, but I have this issue where there's a part of my brain that says, if you're not immediately good at something, then why do it? So I get in there with a toothpick and I'm making little things, and I do one thing that I like, and then I try to improve it, and I mess the whole thing up, and then I just give up and throw it out. So I've definitely tried it before, and it's on the one hand, it's a really therapeutic and rewarding process. I find that lots of little tedious things like that can be really rewarding, but on the other hand, it can be really frustrating because it is so fine and you can screw it up so easily. So physical sculpting can be a lot of fun, and if it's something that interests you, then absolutely give it a shot. But set your expectations for whatever your experience with it is accurate for. But yeah, that's one thing that I'm really excited about, because I completely agree with you. Making something your own is, at least for me, an entirely different experience. I don't mind running pre-made adventures for D&D. However, when it comes down to it, if I have the time and the resources, I will always create my own custom adventures, because it means more to me. And then there's something like, it's kind of like giving somebody a gift that you personally made. It means more to you and hopefully to that person, because it's something that you spent your time and energy on to make something totally unique. And for me, it's the same kind of experience whenever I get my players together and they run through an adventure that I've made that's totally custom. I'm really excited because it's something that I did for them, and I get to see their real-time feedback as they're going through it, and they're getting excited or getting frustrated or whatever it might be. Hopefully it's the emotion that you intended for them to feel, but that's not always the case with D&D. But it's just a totally different feeling, and I completely agree that making something unique just for your own sake and for your own enjoyment of that hobby and of that expression, whether it's models or D&D or writing or 2D art, whatever it might be. I think that's just a really important, sometimes often overlooked aspect of art, is that your own self-expression comes out in this thing, and you get to enjoy something that you physically have created or that you have made unique.
Definitely, and there's more than one medium out there too. I know there's a lot of within this community. There's a lot of people that will go to a 99-cent store and find stuff, and they'll go ahead and heavily mod things, and then before you know it, you've got something that looks completely legit. Yeah. One of the other players inside my old group back in high school was she was an amazing artist by her own right, and she actually did a lot of a lot of knitting, a lot of just, kind of run-of-the-mill craft work type stuff.
Right.
Arts and crafts. And she used to make, she used to grab like little baby dolls, from the craft store, and she would make characters out of it.
Oh.
Like little like chibi-headed
Yeah.
Versions of everything. And it was really, really fun. I mean, it was a different take on things. And I really enjoyed that like what she would kind of come up with. It was completely different than say the style and take that or spin that I would kind of put on something.
Yeah, definitely. And that is a really good point. There's so many different ways of finding a different medium or a different aspect of the art that you're interested in. And for me, I've always really enjoyed writing. For other people, it's creating their own characters, whether sculpting themselves or sculpting digitally or whatever it might be. And it is important that you find what interests you, and maybe getting into 3D sculpting is something that you're interested in, but you find out that there's a different avenue of it, or it leads you to something else that you're more interested in. And that's always an awesome experience to hear how somebody got to something. You were talking about your incredible journey to get where you are now, and the experiences that you've had, and that's awesome. And I've talked to a couple of different people who have started somewhere totally different, and they end up at a completely different spot that is something that they really enjoy and they're finding really fulfilling now, but it's not anything close to what they originally started with. So art is definitely, like anything else, art is a journey, and you might end up somewhere totally different than where you started. But I think the goal should, in my opinion, not to get too philosophical, but I think your goal should always be to find something that you enjoy doing, especially if it's a hobby.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a journey, and it should be one that fulfills the need that you've got. And the fact that, I mean, art is, it's hard to pin down like an actual definition of art. It means so much to many different people. So that's kind of one of the more beautiful nuances of art as well, is the fact that you can't really just, not one thing is art. And anybody that tries to zero in and say, that's just splattering paint, that's not art. It most certainly is.
Yeah.
And that's, I don't know, it's one of the things that I constantly try and remind myself as an artist, is that the experience, life experience, world experience, culture, just your own life experience is going to influence how you perceive things. And, again, not to get too philosophical, but I think it begs responding to, or at least acknowledging in that. That's also, I think, why there's still so much opportunity in this environment to still have new voices. I mean, not everybody's doing not everybody wants to kind of repeat or even download and provide a subscrition to the same type of Patreon. There's maybe there's a loss, or maybe there's an absence of like anime inspired models out there, and that's really how you perceive the game that you're running, or your character. So and everybody's doing stuff that looks like it walks straight out of World of Warcraft. Right. And not to say that there's anything wrong with that.
No, not at all.
I absolutely love World of Warcraft and that type of fantasy. You can see it very heavily influenced the way that the stylization that I have, which that might be something I'd like to elaborate on in terms of finding inspiration. there are a lot of illustrators, a lot of comic book illustrators. I know, I think it was Nikki from Nikki's Hatchery and I were talking about on a forum in terms of where we find inspiration. Being an illustrator, a long time nerd in comic books and in sci-fi and fantasy. I completely nerd out when there's any sort of documentary on an illustrator, on an artist that I followed or that I just adore.
Right.
And I know he has a similar tendency, that being Nikki. He and I were throwing back and forth different artists that we like to go and check out, one of which is the concept artist for Darksiders. He was a comic book illustrator in the 90s. His name is Joe Modera. And his forms are, very exaggerated, proportions, I should say. They're very exaggerated. And I find them to be just that perfect blend of cartoony versus reality.
Right.
And you can see his influence in a lot of World of Warcraft concept art.
Right. Right.
So don't be afraid to go and branch out into different mediums.
Yeah, I think that's great advice.
Find your inspiration and to really kind of dissect forms. One thing that I don't see a lot of beginning artists do nearly enough is take advantage of this one tool up here. See this little silhouette that's up here?
Yeah.
Up in the top left-hand corner?
Yeah, yeah.
That gives you an instant read over your proportions and your forms. Too often, we will zoom in and we will be looking at all this and just spend so much time here that by the time we zoom back out, we go, oh wait, that doesn't quite work. Or maybe later down the road, you're looking at it and you're going, man, what is not working here? I don't know. There's just something about it. And looking at the silhouette up in the top left-hand corner, there is a lot of instant read information that you will gain from just that.
Yeah.
That will also help you, especially when you're doing something for at a miniature scale, right? I mean,
yeah.
There are so many times and I'm encountering this right now actually, because I have an Etsy store where I print and ship out my own models, and all too often, I'll get orders where they want a 28 millimeter scale miniature, and I usually print these at the same scale that Artisan Guild does. It's heroic scale. It ends up being about 40 millimeters tall, 39 to 40 millimeters tall for a standard humanoid.
Okay.
It gives you just enough size where you can you can see the details of the sculpt, but it gives you enough size where you can put some of that detail on the painting side of things.
Right, right.
It still fits in that 1 inch square on your mat. So that's usually the scale that I sculpt at. However, once you knock it down to 28 millimeters, which is actually 32 millimeters to the top of the head of a standard humanoid,
right.
Those details, they just don't show up quite as well. Things become really thin and fragile.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to kind of realize if you're doing this sculpting specific, definitely professionally, but if you're doing it just even as a hobby, it's important to make sure that you sculpt it at the stage or the scale that works best for you.
Yeah.
And look at examples, real world examples. To really figure out the proportions and how they work for that specific scale.
Yeah, I think that's awesome advice. And it's funny, I was actually wondering when we first started, I was looking up at the top left and wondering what the point of that was, but it's a really, really good resource. Now that you mention it, I can absolutely see the use for it. But yeah, I definitely think that's like I said, really, really good advice. And taking a metaphorical step back or a literal step back once in a while to make sure that your proportions still make sense are definitely good practice.
Definitely.
But, well, I think that I have taken up enough of your time. But
or more importantly, hopefully I haven't put anybody to sleep here.
no. I think that, like I said, I really enjoy these conversations, and I hope that people enjoy the more laid back, casual approach to this, and are still finding that there's good information too. I'm certainly definitely really enjoyed this experience and just getting to know you better in general. But also, I think that a lot of the advice that you gave is really, really important and useful on many different disciplines. So I really appreciate you taking the time. It means a lot.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for taking the time to go and speak with me. And I don't know, I mean, I would encourage anybody who is who's got any questions about this to seek me out. I'm more than willing to go ahead and divulge any trade secrets to kind of get you up and hopefully in a similar position where you're making the models and the sculpts that fit your specific aesthetic and desire. So
that's awesome. Well, I will definitely I will put links down in the description for whatever avenues that you want people to reach out to you on, and they'll have that resource then.
Very cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate it. This was an absolute pleasure.
Likewise.